Title: The Curse of Elara Hollow. Chapter 1: The Whispers of Elara. Lena arrived at Elara Hollow in the middle of an autumn afternoon, a gust of wind blowing through the trees as the car pulled up to the weathered gates of her inherited property. The landscape seemed untouched by time. An old, sleepy town surrounded by dense woods, its silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. Her aunt's cottage sat at the very edge of the town, a quaint stone house with ivy climbing its walls and a roof sagging under the weight of years. She had never met her aunt, only heard stories from distant relatives about a woman who had led a solitary life, one filled with secrets. But now, that life had passed, leaving Lena the unexpected heir to the house, and to whatever came with it. Stepping out of the car, Lena felt the weight of the place settle on her shoulders, heavy like the grey clouds that hung low in the sky. She had always wanted a fresh start, away from the noise of the city and the chaos of her old life. But there was something about Elara Hollow that felt off, something unspoken in the air, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The cottage loomed before her, its windows like unblinking eyes, staring out over the winding path that led into the woods. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, a scent that clung to her skin as she made her way toward the front door. The keys her aunt had left behind jingled in her pocket, but as she reached out to unlock the door, a sudden chill crawled up her spine. She paused. "Lena!" The voice was a whisper, soft and faint, as if carried on the wind. At first she thought it was just the wind playing tricks, or perhaps her imagination. But the longer she stood there, the more she became aware of a presence, a watchful feeling, like eyes on her back. She turned around quickly, but there was nothing, only the wind rustling the leaves of the trees. "Lena!" This time the voice was louder, more distinct. It came from behind her, from the depths of the woods. Her heart skipped a beat. No one had called her name. There was no one around. Lena's skin prickled with unease as she turned the key in the door and stepped inside the cottage. The interior of the house was just as she had imagined, dusty but charming in its own way. Wooden beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and old furniture was scattered about, covered in sheets. The house felt untouched, as if frozen in time. She wandered through the rooms, inspecting the old relics her aunt had left behind, from faded family photographs to yellowing books that lined the shelves. But something felt wrong. The whispers were back, louder now, like distant murmurs floating through the walls. The air seemed thick with something unspoken, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. She felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone. "Lena!" The voice, now unmistakable, came from the shadows of the hallway. It was soft but insistent, as though it were beckoning her forward. Lena's mind raced. Was she imagining it? Was the silence of the house playing tricks on her? She told herself it had to be the wind or the creaking of old floorboards. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She could feel the presence of something unseen, lurking just beyond the threshold of her perception. Her steps faltered as she made her way down the narrow hallway. The house seemed to stretch out in all directions, endless, as if the rooms were growing larger with every step. The whispers grew louder, their tones shifting from gentle beckoning to something darker, more insidious. "Lena!" This time, the voice was close, very close. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest, but the hallway was empty, just dimly lit by the waning daylight. Her breath quickened, the air heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. Lena's mind was racing now, her thoughts jumbled. There was no one in the house, but that didn't stop the feeling of eyes watching her, of being followed every time she moved. It was as if the house itself were alive, breathing, pulsating with an energy that was both foreign and intimate, as though it knew her. She reached the end of the hallway and paused in front of a closed door. It was a room she hadn't yet explored, perhaps a bedroom or an office. Hesitantly, she pushed the door open, the old hinges groaning in protest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dying rays of the sun filtering through a single window. Dust particles danced in the air like tiny ghosts. The room seemed Wrong. The shadows were too deep, too thick. Lena. This time the voice wasn't a whisper. It was a full-throated, guttural rasp, coming from somewhere within the room. Lena felt her blood run cold. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs felt like stone, immobile, as though the very room itself was holding her in place. Her eyes flicked to the corner of the room, where something stood. A figure, barely discernible in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its shape indistinct but unmistakably human. Its head was lowered, as though it were waiting for her to speak, to acknowledge its presence. Lena's breath caught in her throat. "Who?" But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if gliding across the floor toward her, her heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't move. The whispers now enveloped her, filling her ears, suffocating her. "Lena." The voice, now a chorus of distorted sounds, seemed to rise from all corners of the room, surrounding her. The figure continued to draw closer, its form becoming more solid, its eyes glowing red, burning into hers. It was no longer just a shadow. It was something alive, something that had been waiting for her, something that had been here long before she arrived. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Lena stumbled back, her hand reaching for the doorframe to steady herself. She looked around the room, empty, silent, but the whispers remained, echoing in the back of her mind, growing louder, more insistent. "Lena, come to us." Her breath came in ragged gasps as she backed out of the room and slammed the door behind her. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. The house was alive, alive with something ancient, something dark, something that was waiting for her. The whispers followed her everywhere now. In every corner of the house, in every room, they whispered her name. The shadow had not been a figment of her imagination, nor had the voice. They were real, too real. They were tied to the house, to the very land beneath it. As Lena sat in the living room, trying to calm her shaking hands, she heard something else. Footsteps, faint and uneven, coming from above. Her mind screamed that it was impossible. She was alone. There was no one else in the house. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then a soft voice, whispering her name again. "Lena." Her heart raced in her chest. She could feel it now. The weight of the place, pressing down on her from all sides. The suffocating presence of something unseen, something watching her. There was no escape from it. The house had claimed her, and it wasn't going to let her leave. In the distance, the wind howled, but Lena could hear nothing else. "Lena." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command. Much to be continued. This expanded Chapter 1 establishes a slow-burning, psychological horror atmosphere with creeping dread and mounting tension. Lena's increasing paranoia is underscored by her growing realization that something malevolent inhabits the house, and the town of Elara Hollow itself. The whispers and the shadows, while initially subtle, begin to feel like a curse that has been waiting for Lena's arrival. Chapter 2. The Echoes of the Hollow. The house groaned, as though it had a life of its own. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames, the trees shaking violently in the storm. The ancient walls of Elara Hollow seemed to creak under the weight of the years they had witnessed, as if trying to warn Lena of something that had been waiting for too long. She lay on her bed, wide-eyed and still, listening to the storm raging outside. Every thundering clap of lightning, every howl of the wind, felt like an intrusion. The outside world was distant and detached from her reality. Inside this forsaken house, she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, though the place should have been empty. Her aunt had gone to bed early, leaving Lena to fend for herself in the quiet gloom of the house. The ticking of the old grandfather clock downstairs filled the silence, each second stretching longer than the last, as though time itself was being held hostage within the walls of Elara Hollow. Lena tried to calm her breathing, but it only seemed to draw attention to the feeling of the air around her, thick with something intangible, something watching, waiting. She was used to the sounds of an old house, the wind sweeping through the eaves, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the hum of the pipes. But tonight, these noises felt different. They weren't the sounds of a house settling. They were whispers. Soft, faint whispers that drifted through the cracks in the walls. At first, she tried to dismiss them as the storm outside or the house's natural creaks, but there was something about them that made her blood run cold. It was a whisper that carried no words but only an insistent tone, as though the very air itself was calling her name. The faintest sound, Lena. Her name, a distant murmur from the other side of the room, barely audible, like a breath against the back of her neck. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. She blinked rapidly, trying to push the creeping dread away. Her aunt had told her the house was old, full of strange sounds and echoes, but Lena wasn't so sure anymore. There it was again, only this time it was closer, right next to her ear. Lena. A voice that was neither male nor female, but something in between. Something ancient, buried deep within the walls. It was low, too low to belong to anything human. The tone was guttural and ethereal, sending a tremor down her spine. Her breathing quickened. She looked around frantically. Nothing was there. But the room felt different now, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. She pushed herself off the bed and walked hesitantly toward the door. Her feet barely made a sound against the old, worn floorboards, but each step felt like it echoed through the oppressive silence. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she gripped the knob. "It's just the wind," she muttered under her breath, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. She didn't believe herself. The house groaned again. The sound was different this time, quicker, sharper, like a footstep. But it wasn't her own. Someone, or something, was walking upstairs. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Her pulse quickened. She stepped back from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps continued above her, each one dragging itself across the ceiling like a slow march of inevitability. The steps weren't heavy, but they were deliberate, as though the entity knew she was there, waiting for her to react. There was no reason for anyone to be in the house. Her aunt had gone to bed hours ago, and Lena had heard no one else arrive. The air grew colder. So cold it made her breath visible in the dim light of her bedside lamp. She shivered uncontrollably, the chill sinking into her bones. She glanced over her shoulder at the darkened corners of the room. The shadows had taken on a life of their own, writhing and twisting as if alive. They seemed to stretch, elongating in the faint light, shifting with a rhythm she couldn't understand. Something was in the room with her, but she didn't want to look directly at it. If she did, she feared it would know that she had acknowledged its presence. The footsteps above her grew louder, closer. Thud, creak, thud. Each step resonated through the floorboards like the beating of a heart, slow and unrelenting. They were no longer above her. The steps had moved. They were coming closer, moving across the room above, nearing the stairs. Lena's legs refused to move. She wanted to run, to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The weight of the house pressed down on her, and it was all she could do to stay still, stay silent, and pray whatever it was would leave. Thud, a heavy footstep, followed by a slow, deliberate creak. It was no longer above her. It was on the same level. She moved cautiously toward the door again, her hand trembling against the doorknob. She wanted to open it, to call for her aunt, but something stopped her. Something in the air was too thick, too heavy, as though the house itself would swallow her whole if she dared step outside. Another soft whisper, louder this time, more insistent. "Lena!" She recoiled. The voice seemed to come from the very walls themselves, from the floor beneath her, from the ceiling, as if it were everywhere at once. She could hear the creaking of the floorboards outside her room, the slow movement of something, or someone, shuffling down the hall. The footsteps were no longer cautious. They were deliberate, methodical, closing in. The door handle turned. Not violently, not with force, but slowly, as if someone, something, was carefully turning it from the outside. The door inched open. Lena gasped and stumbled backward. Her heart thudded in her chest as she backed into the far corner of the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The room was growing darker, the shadows deeper, swallowing everything around her. The door remained ajar, as though an invisible hand had pushed it just wide enough for a single figure to slip through. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a shadow, a figure in the doorway, its outline vague, its form indistinct. It stepped forward, crossing the threshold with a smooth, gliding motion, like it wasn't touching the ground at all. Lena's vision swam. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. The shadows clung to its form, hiding most of its details, but its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers, burning with an unnatural light. The figure moved toward her, its feet never seeming to touch the ground. Lena's body froze in terror. She wanted to scream, to run, but her mouth felt like it was filled with ice. The figure reached toward her, its hand elongated and skeletal, its fingers curling toward her in a way that wasn't human. "Lena, you cannot escape us." The voice was everywhere, inside her head, in the air around her, in the very walls. It was no longer a whisper, it was a command, a promise of something far worse. The shadows around her deepened, closing in, and she felt the weight of their presence on her chest, suffocating, crushing. The temperature dropped to a freezing cold, but the figure did not seem to notice. Its eyes never left her, burning with a cold, unnatural fire. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The door was closed. The shadows slowly receded back into the corners of the room, the temperature rising, though Lena could still feel the icy grip of fear holding her heart. Her body shook uncontrollably as she collapsed onto the bed, her breath ragged. She hadn't imagined it. Whatever it was, whatever it had been, it was real. But as the night wore on and the storm raged outside, she could feel it, lurking in the dark, watching, waiting. And no matter how hard she tried to convince herself it was just a nightmare, Lena knew deep down that Elara Hollow was not a place for the living, and she was no longer alone. To be continued. In this expanded version of Chapter 2, Lena's sense of fear and isolation deepens as she faces a supernatural presence in the house. The footsteps that seem to come from nowhere, the figure that manifests, and the voice that speaks to her all build the atmosphere of creeping dread. This chapter moves the story forward by escalating the tension and making Lena question the very reality she thought she understood. The house itself seems to take on a malevolent life of its own, and Lena's descent into terror has only just begun. Chapter 3. The Echoes of the Past. Expanded. The house felt different today. Or perhaps it was Lena who had changed. The weight of it pressed against her chest, a silent burden that she could neither shake nor escape. Each step she took seemed heavier than the last, the air thicker, as though the house was somehow aware of her presence. Watching, waiting, Lena had tried to push the strange events of the previous night to the back of her mind. But no matter how hard she tried, the whispering voices, the shadow in the cellar, the feeling of being drawn toward the darkness, gnawed at her. She couldn't explain it, couldn't find the words for the deep sense of wrongness that had settled into her bones. She awoke early that morning, her skin slick with sweat, a suffocating heat wrapping itself around her body. She had dreamed again, but this time, the dream had been more than just a fleeting vision. It had been a memory, or perhaps a warning. She had wandered through the house's hallways, but it had felt as if they were alive, pulsating with something dark and sinister. At the end of the dream, she had stood before a mirror, her own reflection staring back at her with hollow, empty eyes. The nightmare clung to her, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. She could still feel the cold touch of the mirror, the way her reflection had seemed to move on its own. The glass had rippled like water, distorting her features until they were no longer hers. And then the voice, faint at first, like a distant murmur, had called her name, drawing her into the dark. She'd woken up with the sound of her own name echoing in her ears. Shaking her head, Lena forced herself to focus. She couldn't let the dream control her. It was just that, a dream. But as she stepped into the hallway, her skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation that she wasn't alone. The silence of the house was oppressive, suffocating. There were no creaks, no sounds of movement, just the deafening stillness. The kind of quiet that made you question whether you were hearing the world, or if the world was hearing you. Her footsteps echoed in the empty halls as she walked down the stairs. The house seemed to grow darker, even though it was still morning. It was as though the light couldn't penetrate the air, as if the house itself had absorbed the sun's warmth and withheld it. Everything felt muted, the world outside faint and distant. She made her way into the kitchen, hoping the familiar act of brewing coffee would ground her. The scent of the rich brew filled the room, but it couldn't mask the chill in the air, the dampness that seemed to seep from the very walls. Lena took a sip, but the coffee tasted flat, lifeless, like everything else in the house. The previous night, she had spent hours searching for answers, rummaging through every nook and cranny of the house. But there was nothing to explain the strange occurrences, nothing to explain the shadowy figure in the cellar, or the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The house was old, yes, but it wasn't the age that unsettled her. It was the weight, the sense of history that pressed in from every corner. This house was not just old, it was ancient, and it carried something dark within it. By midday, Lena felt the compulsion to explore again, to search for answers that continued to elude her. She had no other choice but to follow the invisible thread that pulled her deeper into the house, deeper into the mystery. It was as though the house itself was beckoning her, calling her towards something she couldn't yet comprehend. She started on the second floor where the air felt heavier than usual. The wooden floors groaned beneath her as she stepped cautiously into the hallway. She passed the first few rooms, her eyes darting from one to the next, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The furniture was old, draped in dusty sheets, but there was nothing unusual about any of it, nothing out of place. And yet, there was a room at the very end of the hallway, a room Lena had not yet dared to enter. It was the only door that had remained locked since she arrived at the house. No matter how much she tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door itself was refusing her entry, keeping its secrets hidden. But today was different. Today Lena could feel it. She could feel the door calling to her. Taking a deep breath, she reached out and grasped the cold brass handle. Her fingers trembled as she twisted it. The lock clicked open with an unsettling finality, and the door creaked inward. The room beyond was dim, the air thick with dust. There was no light from outside, only the faint glow of the hallway behind her. She stepped inside cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the heavy carpet that covered the floor. The room was a strange one. It was larger than most of the other rooms in the house, but it was filled with an oppressive stillness. The walls were lined with shelves, but there were no books or knickknacks. Instead, there were old, cracked mirrors leaning against the walls, their surfaces cloudy with age. The mirrors were not framed. They were simply leaned haphazardly against the walls, their edges sharp and unfinished. Lena's breath hitched as she moved deeper into the room, her eyes scanning the mirrors. Each one seemed to hold a reflection of something different. Shadows, distorted figures, the faintest hint of movement. She could feel her heartbeat quicken as she moved closer to the nearest mirror. Her reflection was the first thing she saw. Her own face, pale and drawn. But there was something wrong with it. Her reflection didn't match her movements. The figure in the mirror seemed to shift ever so slightly, as though it was waiting for her to make the first move. The longer she stared, the more the reflection seemed to change. Her eyes were no longer brown. They were black, like empty voids, as though the mirrors were stealing her soul. She recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers from last night returned, faint at first, but growing louder, reverberating around her like a chorus of voices in the shadows. Lena! The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice she had heard in the cellar, in the darkness beneath the house. She turned quickly, scanning the room for the source. But there was no one there. No figure, no shadow, just the mirrors, reflecting her fear. You have to listen to me, the voice continued. And this time it was closer. Lena felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, and she spun around. But again, there was nothing. The air in the room had grown colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Lena could see her breath misting in front of her. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on a corner of the carpet. Her pulse was racing, each beat a painful reminder of the terror gnawing at her. Then, from the farthest mirror in the room, something moved. It wasn't a reflection of Lena. It was something else. A dark figure, cloaked and indistinct, stood behind the glass. Its eyes glowed faintly, like two pale stars in the dark. It didn't speak, but the message was clear. It wanted her. Lena turned and fled from the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The door slammed shut behind her, but she didn't stop to look back. Her heart was in her throat, her breathing erratic. She had to get out of this house. There was something inside it, something waiting for her, and she didn't know if she could escape it. But as she ran down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, the voices merging into a cacophony of sound. They weren't just in her head, they were all around her, filling the air. Lena felt the weight of the house pressing in on her, the walls closing in, the very floor beneath her feet threatening to collapse. She stumbled down the stairs and into the kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. "Get out," she whispered to herself. "You have to get out of here." But the house wouldn't let her go. It wouldn't release her from its grasp. And she realized, in that moment of clarity, that she wasn't running from something in the house. She was running toward it. As to be continued. This expanded version of Chapter 3 continues to deepen the psychological horror of Lena's experience in the house. The sense of isolation grows, and she begins to encounter more direct supernatural elements, including distorted reflections, an ominous voice, and the eerie mirrors that seem to hold something malevolent. Each moment intensifies her feeling that the house itself is alive, conscious, and hostile. You can further build on this narrative in future chapters, adding more layers of mystery, exploring Lena's unraveling state of mind, and eventually revealing the dark history of the house. Chapter 4: The Forgotten Rooms. The rain hammered against the windows as Lena sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the dim light leaking through the blinds. The storm outside had grown worse since the morning, and the wind howled through the cracks in the house, sending shivers down her spine. But it wasn't the storm that was making her uneasy. It was the house itself, the mirrors, the whispers, the shadows that seemed to move just beyond the corner of her vision. They were all becoming more real with each passing day. Every corner of the house, every door, felt like a riddle she couldn't solve. The walls were closing in, and Lena couldn't escape the feeling that the house had a presence. One that was aware of her, watching her every move. She had tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. The isolation, the stress, the creeping unease, all of it could be chalked up to the house's oppressive silence, to the years of abandonment and decay that seemed to seep into her very bones. But there was something more, something deeper and darker that she couldn't quite grasp. The phone call from her mother had only made things worse. Her mother had sounded distant, distracted, as though she was speaking from the other side of a fog. Lena had tried to tell her what was happening in the house, but her mother hadn't believed her. "It's just an old house, sweetheart," she had said in a tired voice. "You're just adjusting. It'll get better once you're used to it." But Lena knew better. This wasn't about adjusting. This was about something that had been buried in the past. Something that had been waiting for her to uncover. And now that she had stepped inside, it wouldn't let her go. She stood up, pacing the room, trying to shake the feeling that the house was alive, breathing, moving in sync with her own anxious heartbeat. The door creaked open suddenly, and she froze. It was strange. The door had never opened on its own before, not in all the time she had been staying here. Lena swallowed hard, a lump rising in her throat. She had thought about leaving, but something deep within her, had kept her from walking out the door. It was as though the house itself was holding her captive, forcing her to stay, to witness whatever horror it was waiting to reveal. She stepped cautiously toward the open door. The hallway beyond was dark, the shadows deeper than usual, like a pool of ink waiting to swallow her whole. The house seemed to have no end, no logical layout. Every time Lena thought she knew its structure, she found another corner, another forgotten room. It was as if the house were a maze that shifted and rearranged itself, as if it were alive, adapting to her every movement. As she stepped into the hallway, she glanced at the other rooms, half expecting to see something moving in the corners of her eyes. But there was nothing, just emptiness. the echo of her own footsteps bouncing off the walls like a distant mocking laugh. Lena moved down the hallway, drawn by the same pull she had felt before, the same compulsion to explore, to find the answers that eluded her. She had always been curious, always wanted to know the truth, no matter how dark it might be. But now, in the face of what she was beginning to understand, that curiosity felt more like a curse than a blessing. Her footsteps slowed as she neared the end of the hall. There, hidden behind a faded tapestry, was a door she had never seen before. It was small, almost insignificant compared to the other doors in the house, and yet there was something about it, something that made her heart race. Lena reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal of the doorknob. The door was locked, just like all the others. But this time, there was no resistance when she turned it. The lock clicked open, a low echoing sound that reverberated in her bones. She hesitated, but only for a moment. The house was calling her, pulling her inside, and for reasons she couldn't fully understand, she stepped into the room. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood. The room was small, smaller than most of the others, and completely bare except for a few pieces of old furniture shoved into the corners. A single window at the far side of the room was covered in grime, the glass so opaque that it blocked out any light from outside. Lena moved deeper into the room, her eyes scanning every corner, every inch of space. The walls were lined with old portraits, paintings of people she didn't recognize. Their faces were somber, their eyes dark and hollow, as though they were trapped in time, unable to escape their painted prison. She moved toward one of the paintings, drawn to it inexplicably. The figure in the painting was a woman, her face half hidden in shadows. But it wasn't just the woman's expression that unnerved Lena. It was the way the painting seemed to shift as she stared at it. The woman's eyes seemed to follow her, flicking from side to side, always aware of her presence. Lena reached out to touch the frame, and as her fingers brushed against the cold wood, a sudden sound broke the silence. A soft, almost inaudible whisper, as though someone were standing just behind her. She whipped around, her heart pounding, but the room was empty, still, silent. She let out a shaky breath, forcing herself to calm down. It was just her nerves. She was letting the house get to her, making her paranoid. But as she turned back to the painting, she noticed something new. The woman in the portrait, her eyes, were no longer hollow. They were filled with a strange, unsettling emotion. Fear, desperation. Lena's blood ran cold. She knew it wasn't her imagination. The woman in the painting was trying to tell her something. But what? She stepped closer to the painting, her face now inches from the glass. As she stared into the woman's eyes, the room seemed to darken, the edges of the walls blurring, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Lena felt as if she were sinking into the painting itself. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room, breaking her trance. Lena staggered back, gasping for air as the room returned to its normal state. The air was colder now, the shadows longer. The door slammed shut behind her with such force that it rattled the walls. She jumped, her heart pounding in her chest as she turned toward the exit. The house had never felt more suffocating, the walls closing in as though they were alive, hungry. But there was no escape. The house had already claimed her. Lena's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed toward the door. She fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The door was stuck, impossibly stuck, as if the house itself had sealed her in. Her hands shook as she yanked at the knob, but it didn't budge. Her panic rose, and the air grew heavier, as though the house were watching her, waiting for her to break. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again, this time louder, clearer. It was the same voice, the one that had followed her since she arrived. Lena spun around, her eyes wide with terror. "Who's there?" she screamed. But there was no answer. She didn't need one. The shadows in the room were closing in on her, swirling, forming shapes, figures that flickered in and out of existence. There was a feeling of weightlessness, a sensation that she was being drawn into something beyond her control. The walls began to pulse, the floor shifting beneath her feet. It wasn't just the house that was alive now, it was her too. Her body was no longer her own, her limbs stiffening as though they had been encased in stone. And then, the voice spoke again. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. Come with us. And to be continued. This is an expanded version of Chapter 4, deepening the sense of psychological and supernatural horror. The focus on the eerie room, the unsettling painting, and the inescapable presence of the house creates a tense atmosphere of paranoia and fear. The narrative continues to explore Lena's unraveling sense of reality as she's drawn deeper into the house's mysterious and malevolent force. Author with canvas, Chapter 5. The Unraveling Truth. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows of the old house, casting eerie, distorted shadows across the dust-covered floor. Lena awoke, though she wasn't sure when she had fallen asleep. Her dreams had been a blur of faces, distorted and twisted, their eyes empty, hollow. Yet, they were familiar faces. Faces she had seen in passing, in the photos strewn across her aunt's shelves. Faces she could never quite place. And then there was the other face, the one she couldn't forget, the one that haunted her every moment, her Aunt Melinda's. It had been 3 days since Lena had arrived in Elara Hollow, and the weight of the house, the atmosphere, seemed to be pressing down harder with each passing hour. The isolation had begun to sink in deeper than she could have anticipated. There were no visitors, no phone calls, nothing. It was as though the outside world had ceased to exist the moment she stepped foot in this cursed place. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to focus. Her mind was a mess of fragments, memories, and confusion. She hadn't told anyone about the strange things she'd seen or heard. The shadowy figures, the whispering voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The unease she felt wasn't just a product of her surroundings. Something far more sinister was at play here. Something that seemed to have a purpose for her. The house had welcomed her in, and now it would never let her leave. Lena stood up, the creaking floorboards beneath her feet sounding unnaturally loud in the silence of the room. She had spent the last few hours examining every room of the house, opening every door, searching for some kind of clue. Her aunt's study, once a place of quiet sanctuary, was now just another room filled with eerie relics. Bookshelves crammed with yellowing tomes, faded maps of places Lena didn't recognize, and strange artifacts she didn't dare touch. There was no sign of Melinda. The air felt thicker here, and the deeper she explored, the more oppressive the house seemed to become. She thought she heard something faintly in the walls again, a low hum, a pulse, thump, thump, thump. It was as though something was breathing beneath the house, something alive, something that was calling to her. But every time she tried to listen more closely, the sound faded, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. With a grimace, Lena turned and walked toward the staircase. She had already explored the lower floor and the attic, but something about the cellar still unsettled her. It wasn't just the darkened space or the scent of decay that clung to the air. There was something else, something hidden, something beneath the house. She had to go down there. She had to see it for herself. The cellar door creaked open with a low groan as she stepped onto the stairs. The darkness beneath beckoned to her, swallowing the faint light from the upper floor. With each step, her heart beat louder in her chest, each thud a reminder that she was no longer alone in this house. The silence wrapped around her like a suffocating cloak. She reached for the light switch, but there was nothing, just the cold stone, the dampness of the earth. "Lena!" The voice came from behind her. Lena spun around, her pulse racing. She knew it hadn't been her own voice. It hadn't come from anywhere near her, but it had been clear, distinct. Lena. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared into the darkness. There was no one there, but the voice, so clear, so familiar, had called her name. She could feel her body trembling, her legs almost giving way beneath her. She forced herself to move, descending further into the cellar. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in on her. The sensation was overwhelming, like the walls themselves were shifting, bending to some unseen force. The sound of her footsteps echoed loudly, distorting in the vast emptiness. She could feel the space beneath her feet growing deeper, the steps stretching out into infinity. At the bottom of the stairs, the world opened into an expansive cavern, much larger than the house itself. A chill ran through Lena as she took in her surroundings. The cellar wasn't just a small room under the house. It was something far more vast, an underground labyrinth stretching deep beneath the earth. And there in the distance, something flickered. A light. It was faint, far away, but it was there. Lena's breath caught in her throat again, this time for a different reason. She wasn't alone. She hadn't been alone. There was something else here, something, or someone, that was waiting for her. Her feet carried her forward, seemingly of their own accord. Every part of her screamed for her to turn back, to run as far as she could, but she couldn't. The pull was too strong, and the light, the flickering glow that called to her, was becoming impossible to resist. She reached the end of the tunnel, and before her, a door stood ajar. The light spilled from the crack, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted like dark fingers reaching out toward her. Lena pushed the door open with a slow, deliberate motion, the hinges screeching in protest. As she stepped through, her eyes adjusted to the dimness of the room. The walls were lined with old, tattered tapestries, faded, their once vibrant colors now ghostly echoes of their former selves. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay. But there was something else, something foul, a rotting, almost sickly sweet odor that made her stomach churn. She turned her gaze toward the center of the room. In the middle, an ancient wooden chest sat upon a stone pedestal. It looked out of place here, like a relic, a forgotten thing left behind by time. The chest was locked, the edges worn from years of neglect. But it wasn't the chest that caught her attention. It was the figure standing beside it. She hadn't seen it at first, standing in the shadow of the far wall. But now that she did, she couldn't look away. A woman. Or what had once been a woman. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were milky white. Blank, lifeless. She was dressed in old, tattered clothes, and her hands, bone-thin, brittle, hung limply at her sides. There was something unnatural about her. Her presence seemed to bend the very air around her, warping the space in unsettling ways. Lena's body went cold. She wanted to run, but she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her feet frozen to the floor. The woman began to sway, her head tilting slightly as though trying to see Lena more clearly, but her eyes remained fixed in an empty stare. Then the woman opened her mouth, and a low, guttural sound emanated from her throat. Something between a whisper and a growl. Lena. It was the same voice. Lena's heart skipped a beat as the world around her seemed to pulse with life, the very air vibrating with a low hum, like an ancient force stirring from its slumber. The woman's lips curled into a smile, a twisted, unnatural smile that sent waves of nausea through Lena's stomach. Before Lena could react, the figure moved. She wasn't sure if the woman had actually moved, or if the shadows themselves had reached out to pull her forward. But in an instant, she was standing right in front of Lena, her dead eyes staring into hers. "You've come for the truth," the woman rasped, her voice as dry as dust. "But the truth will consume you, child. The house will never let you go." Lena felt a wave of terror wash over her, but there was no time to react. The woman reached forward, her cold, skeletal fingers brushing against Lena's cheek, and the room seemed to collapse inward. Darkness swallowed her whole, and Lena was lost in the abyss. To be continued. This expanded chapter delves deeper into Lena's psychological and physical descent into the supernatural horrors of Elara Hollow. The creeping sense of dread grows as Lena approaches the source of the mystery in the cellar, encountering a disturbing figure who hints at the horrifying truths yet to be uncovered. The supernatural force in the house becomes more evident, wrapping around her in ways that are both psychological and physical, leading her further into its grip. Chapter 6. The Unseen Watcher. Lena awoke with a jolt, her body shuddering as if she had just been pulled from the depths of an ocean, gasping for breath. Her mind struggled to piece together fragments of reality as her eyes blinked rapidly in the half-darkness. She lay in her bed, sheets tangled around her limbs, her heart thumping wildly in her chest. There was no reason for her to be so unsettled, no reason for the cold sweat that clung to her skin. But the sensation that something had been in the room with her, watching her, was unmistakable. The house was eerily silent. Too silent. Even the hum of the refrigerator downstairs had ceased. The world outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Lena sat up, her gaze sweeping over the familiar contours of the room, the chipped wallpaper, the dim glow of the single lamp by her bed, the old wooden dresser, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the feeling remained, gnawing at her like an itch she couldn't reach. She had become accustomed to the strange occurrences in the house, the creaking floors, the odd drafts, the whispering shadows. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a thick, almost tangible presence pressing against her skin. The silence, too, felt unnatural, as if it had grown deeper, thicker, smothering her every breath. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the blanket, her pulse quickening. What was happening to me? Lena swung her legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cool touch of the floorboards beneath her bare feet. She hesitated for a moment, listening for any sound, anything that could break the suffocating stillness. But there was nothing. No wind outside. No cars passing by. The house felt closed in, as though the world outside had been swallowed whole. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the fog of sleep that clung to her mind, but it didn't help. The sensation of being watched didn't fade. In fact, it only grew stronger. Every small creak, every whisper of the house settling seemed amplified, as if it were mocking her paranoia. She couldn't stay in here any longer. She had to move. She had to do something. Grabbing her robe from the back of the chair beside her, Lena wrapped it around her shoulders and stood up, her legs weak beneath her. She didn't know where she was going, only that the stillness of the room was suffocating, and the house seemed to shift around her, its walls closing in ever so slightly with each passing second. The hallway stretched before her, dark and empty. The flickering light from the lamp in her room did little to illuminate the path ahead. She stood at the threshold, staring into the blackness. In the past, Lena had felt safe in the house's familiar embrace, but now, that very familiarity felt wrong, as though the house had changed in subtle, insidious ways. With a deep breath, she stepped into the hallway. The floorboards groaned underfoot, as they always did at night, but tonight it was louder, more pronounced. She paused for a moment, heart racing. Something was different. Every small sound felt amplified in the quiet, as though the house was listening, waiting for her next move. She glanced down the hallway. The shadows at the far end seemed deeper, more oppressive. The house felt alive, shifting in the dark like something sentient. She couldn't help but feel the overwhelming urge to turn back to her room, to shut the door and lock herself in. But she couldn't. Something was pulling her forward, pushing her to explore, to confront whatever it was that had been creeping at the edges of her mind for days. Lena's bare feet brushed against the cold wood as she walked down the hall. Her mind raced with thoughts of the strange occurrences, of the whispers she'd heard earlier, of the cold touch that had run down her spine in the dead of night. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but now, standing in the hallway, she had no choice. Something was wrong with this house. The shadows seemed to shift as she moved, undulating in the corner of her vision, like dark tendrils reaching out to her, trying to draw her closer. Her breath quickened. She turned her head, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was lurking just out of sight, but every time she did, the shadows seemed to move faster, pulling further into the darkness. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling from within. It was the door to the attic. Lena had never been particularly afraid of the attic. In fact, she had spent a fair amount of time there over the years, going through old boxes, sorting through forgotten memories, and occasionally retrieving things that had been left behind. But tonight the attic felt different. The very idea of going up there made her skin crawl. And yet she couldn't stop herself. The door beckoned to her. The closer she got, the heavier the air became, until it felt as though each breath she took required effort. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she could feel her pulse hammering in her throat. Every step was like wading through thick fog, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Lena reached the door and stopped, her hand hovering just above the handle. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to leave, to find safety, but she didn't. She had to know, she had to understand. With shaking fingers, she grasped the cold brass handle and pushed. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, revealing the stairs leading up to the attic. The dim light spilling from the open door cast long shadows on the wooden steps. the darkness above somehow deeper than the darkness below. Lena hesitated for a moment, staring into the attic's black maw, her heartbeat a dull thudding in her ears. The air smelled stale, like something long forgotten, sealed away and left to rot. She felt her stomach turn, a sense of dread curling inside her gut, but she stepped forward. The stairs creaked beneath her feet as she ascended, each step seeming to echo louder in the silence, the sound reverberating in her skull. The farther she went, the more the darkness seemed to close in around her, until she could barely see her own feet. Her hand gripped the railing, the wood smooth but cold under her fingers. As she reached the top of the stairs, she heard it. A soft, scratching noise, like something scraping against the floor in the distance. The sound came from deep within the attic, a place she had never dared to venture before. Her mind raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What was that? The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever it was getting closer. Lena's legs wavered beneath her, her resolve slipping with every passing second. She wanted to turn back, to flee down the stairs and lock the door behind her, but something deep inside her, demanded that she continue. "You're here now, you've come this far." She rounded the corner into the attic, the space feeling impossibly vast and cold. Dust hung thick in the air, suspended like some invisible web. The light from the small bulb above her flickered, casting erratic shadows across the cluttered space. Old furniture, forgotten boxes, and broken trinkets littered the floor. But the scratching continued, coming from somewhere deeper, farther back in the shadows. Her eyes strained to see through the gloom, and then she saw it. A figure, a dark, hunched shape, sitting in the farthest corner, its back turned to her, the scratching sound emanating from it as its hands, its long, twisted fingers, scraped across the floor. Lena's throat tightened, her breath caught in her chest. She tried to step forward, but her legs were frozen, her feet rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. It just continued its maddening, repetitive motion, scraping and scraping as though it were oblivious to her very existence. But the silence in the attic was thick now, suffocating, pressing against her chest. She could feel something watching her, something in the shadows, something just beyond her perception. The closer she got to the figure, the more suffocating the air became. And then, with a suddenness that made her blood run cold, the figure stopped. The silence was deafening. Slowly, the figure began to turn its head. Lena's stomach churned, her legs giving way as she stumbled backward. And then it spoke. "I see you," it whispered, its voice hollow, void of emotion, like the scraping of nails against a chalkboard. The words cut through Lena like a knife. Lena screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The house seemed to pulse with life, the walls groaning, the air thick with the scent of decay. She ran, stumbling backward down the stairs, her heart hammering, her mind a blur of terror. The figure's voice echoed in her mind. "I see you." To be continued. Or this version of Chapter 6 further deepens the atmosphere of horror and disorientation. The sense of Lena being hunted by something unseen yet ever-present is amplified. The house itself seems to be an active participant in her terror, with its shifting shadows, unnatural silence, and oppressive atmosphere. By focusing on Lena's gradual unraveling, the chapter becomes both psychological and supernatural, pushing the reader to feel as trapped as she does. Chapter 7. The Watcher in the Dark. Lena awoke with a start, her body drenched in sweat as if she had been submerged in a cold, dark lake. Her chest heaved with every breath, each inhale jagged and sharp, as if the very air she was breathing was fighting to escape her. The room around her was familiar, yet somehow wrong. The silence was overwhelming, the kind of silence that felt too thick, as though it had substance, something alive, something watching her, waiting. She tried to sit up, but the movement felt unnatural. Her limbs were stiff, heavy, as though they had been submerged in concrete. Her eyes darted around the dimly lit room, the shadows stretching and warping in strange angles. The lamp beside her flickered, casting erratic light that made the walls of the room appear to pulse, as though they were breathing along with her. Something was different. It wasn't the room. It was the house. The house had changed. Her thoughts swirled. She couldn't focus, couldn't shake the unease crawling beneath her skin. The air felt colder than usual, colder than any winter's night. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, had become more intense, more suffocating. "It's nothing," she whispered aloud, her voice fragile, betraying the tremor in her throat. "It's just the house settling, that's all." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were hollow. The house wasn't just settling, it was alive, and it was aware of her. Lena swung her legs over the side of the bed, the cold wooden floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The sound was unsettling, echoing through the room as though the house itself was groaning in response. She paused, straining to hear any other sounds, any sign that the world outside her room was normal. But all she heard was the silence. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a drum, louder and faster than before. She could feel the weight of it in her throat, could taste the panic that rose from deep within her. She stood, her feet unsteady, her body trembling despite the heat that radiated from her skin. She wasn't sure if it was from fear or the strange chill that had taken root in the air. She reached for the door, but her hand trembled as she grasped the cold brass handle. She pulled, and the door creaked open with an unnatural slowness, as if something was holding it back. A wave of cold air hit her face as she stepped into the hallway. The darkness ahead was absolute, impenetrable. The hallway was too still, too quiet. The shadows, thick and heavy, clung to the walls, as though they had weight. The house seemed to be leaning in toward her, pressing her in from all sides. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so utterly alone. "It's just the darkness," she muttered, but her words felt like lies. "The house is old. The air's just cooler at night." She took a hesitant step forward, but before she could move further, the floor beneath her seemed to groan, a low guttural sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the house. Her breath hitched. She stopped. The creaking had come from the staircase. It wasn't the usual sound of an old house settling. It was something else, something that had weight, something that was alive. Her fingers clenched into fists. She didn't want to look, didn't want to face what might be lurking in the dark. But she couldn't help herself. Her head turned slowly toward the stairs at the far end of the hallway. The staircase led down to the lower levels, but tonight it seemed like the doorway to another world, a world just beyond the threshold of her understanding. A flicker of light caught her eye, just at the bottom of the stairs. She blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the dark. Her heart stopped for a second, the silence pressing against her eardrums until she could feel it pulsing in her skull. She couldn't move. Her legs were frozen, locked in place as though the house itself had gripped her, unwilling to let go. Then a sound, a whisper. Faint, like the rustling of dry leaves, but it was there, just beyond her reach. A voice so soft that at first she thought it was a trick of the wind. She strained to hear, but the words were indistinguishable, a whisper so insistent it vibrated through the walls, through her bones. Lena swallowed, her mouth dry. Her head was spinning. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. "Get a grip," she told herself, her voice barely a murmur. But that whisper, it was getting louder. "Who's there?" Her voice cracked, breaking the silence. The whisper stopped. A horrible, suffocating stillness hung in the air. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. And then she heard it. A footstep. A single, deliberate step from below. It wasn't just the floorboards creaking. It was the distinct sound of someone, something, moving. Her heart leaped in her chest, hammering against her ribs. "No!" she gasped. "No, no, no!" But the steps came again, slower this time, heavier, like the footfalls of someone who was dragging themselves across the floor. The sound was unnervingly close, as though the figure was right below her, hidden in the shadows. Without thinking, Lena began to move. The instinct to flee surged in her chest, pushing her forward. She reached for the railing of the stairs, the cold metal biting into her palm, and began to descend. Her breath caught in her throat as the temperature seemed to drop with each step, colder and colder, until it felt as though the very air was freezing in place, a suffocating frost that crept into her lungs. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs seemed to swallow the light from the hallway. But she kept going, the rhythmic thud of her feet against the stairs mingling with the sound of that other presence, moving just beyond her reach. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice trembling, but the darkness didn't respond, only the whispering. She reached the bottom of the stairs, but the floor was cold and slick beneath her feet. She felt a chill wrap around her neck, and for the first time, she realized how wrong the air felt. Too thick, too oppressive. There, in the corner of the room, was the figure. Lena froze. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was standing in the corner, its back to her, yet she could feel its gaze on her, piercing through the darkness. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its silhouette outlined only by the faintest light of the hallway behind her. It was clothed in a tattered, dark cloak, the fabric flowing like smoke around its body. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know if it was human, but she knew it wasn't something that could be ignored. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, but her body wouldn't move. The air felt heavy, pressing against her chest, forcing the words down her throat. It was as if the house itself had taken control of her, locking her in place. Then, slowly, the figure turned its head. Lena's breath hitched. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just an empty void where its features should have been. Blackness, endless, swirling blackness that consumed everything in its wake. The whisper started again, this time louder, more distinct. "You belong to me now." The figure's voice came, low and guttural, and the very sound of it shook her to the core. "And you will never leave." Lena opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her limbs were heavy, like stones, her body frozen in the grip of something that defied explanation. The figure advanced, its footfalls silent, and Lena could do nothing but watch as it moved closer. "You're mine now," it whispered again, the darkness around it swirling like smoke, choking the light, suffocating the room. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening as the figure's shape loomed larger. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "You belong to the house." Lena felt a cold hand grasp her wrist. The darkness closed in, and the last thing she saw before everything went black was the smile, wide, twisted, and knowing, of the thing that had been waiting for her. To be continued. This expanded version deepens the atmosphere of dread and psychological tension, heightening Lena's sense of entrapment. The entity now feels more palpable, both a physical and psychological threat, with its movements and presence slowly unraveling Lena's sanity. Chapter 8. The Buried Truth. Lena's breath came in shallow bursts as she descended into the basement. The weight of the air around her seemed to press down with an almost physical force, like the house itself was holding her, forcing her to confront what had been hidden for so long. She barely noticed the darkened corners of the basement, where shadows curled like thick ropes, suffocating the light. Every step she took seemed to echo too loudly, each footfall reverberating through the damp, musty air. The walls here were more oppressive than in the rest of the house. Thick stone blocks lined the corners, some cracked, others stained with age and moisture. The ceiling was low and sagged under the weight of time, as though it was a forgotten vault that had long since abandoned the concept of safety. The musty smell of mildew and dust was sharp, but there was something else beneath it. A faint, metallic scent, like iron or old blood, lingering in the air. It made Lena's stomach lurch as she moved deeper into the basement, the sense of wrongness growing with each step. Her gaze flicked to the far side of the room, where an ancient wooden trunk stood in the dim light, partially obscured by old dusty furniture covered with thick yellowed sheets. It was the only thing in the room that didn't blend into the surroundings. It stood out, oddly pristine compared to the decay around it. The air around it seemed colder, as though the trunk itself was a relic of a darker time, one that demanded respect, even fear. Lena approached it cautiously. The closer she got, the more she could feel a strange, static-like energy in the air. It was as if the trunk was charged, humming with a silent presence. Her fingers tingled with an unexplainable sensation when she reached out to touch it. For a brief moment, she hesitated, unsure whether she should disturb whatever dark thing lay within. But she had to know. She had to. The whispers from the mirror, the photo of the house with the woman who looked like her. It was all too much. The house was speaking to her. Or perhaps she was simply hearing echoes from a past that could never be silenced. Either way, the answers were here. With a slow, deliberate movement, Lena unlatched the trunk, the metal hinge groaning in protest. The air around her seemed to hold its breath. When the lid creaked open, a thin stream of dust floated up, settling in the dim light. Inside, the trunk was filled with old, brittle papers, yellowed with age, and several tattered cloth-bound books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. But it was the small wooden box at the bottom that caught her eye. Something about it seemed to draw her in, as though it was the core of whatever secrets this place held. Her hand trembled as she reached inside, lifting the box. It was cold to the touch, so cold it seemed unnatural. The smooth surface of the box had an odd texture, almost as if it were made from a substance that didn't belong in this world. She opened the box with trembling hands, revealing a stack of photographs stacked carefully inside, their edges curled with age. The first photograph she picked up was of the house, much as it appeared now. But the yard was well kept and the windows clean. It was a photo taken in a time before decay had taken hold of the place. But that wasn't what stopped her. What caught her attention was the woman in the photo. She stood in the foreground, dressed in an old-fashioned, dark dress, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes too wide, too knowing. Her features were sharp, almost too sharp, as if her face was being pulled by invisible strings. Lena's stomach turned. She leaned in closer, peering at the woman's face. The resemblance was undeniable. This was her, or someone who looked exactly like her, down to the deep-set eyes and the dark hair falling in waves around the shoulders. Her heartbeat quickened. She wanted to pull away, but her hands were frozen, clutching the photograph with the kind of desperation that scared her. The woman was standing on the very porch Lena had passed through not hours ago. And though the woman's gaze was directed at the camera, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the camera she was looking at. No, it was something behind the lens, something watching. Lena flipped the photograph over, almost instinctively, her eyes scanning the back. There was a single word scrawled in faded ink. Look. She recoiled, the word seeming to reverberate in her mind long after she let go of the photo. Look. At what? Before she could consider that thought further, she flipped through the stack of photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. The same woman appeared again and again, standing in different parts of the house, always with that same vacant expression, as if she were a shadow of someone who had once been there. In one photo, she was standing next to an open window, gazing out into the yard. In another, she was sitting in a chair by the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap. But it was the last photograph, the one buried at the very bottom, that made Lena's breath catch in her throat. It was a picture of the same woman, only now she was no longer just standing in the house. She was holding something, a mirror. But it wasn't a typical mirror. Its surface was black, completely dark, reflecting nothing but its own emptiness. It was as if the mirror contained an entire universe, one that was dark and endless, with no boundaries or shape. The woman's hand held the mirror tightly, her fingers curled around the edge with a grip that seemed almost too tight, her knuckles white with tension. Her eyes were wide, but this time there was something different. There was a smile, small, twisted, knowing. Knowing what? The man standing next to her was just as disturbing. His face was too smooth, as though it had been sculpted, like wax, his features eerily symmetrical, his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, his gaze fixed on the woman. But there was something behind it, something otherworldly that made Lena's blood run cold. The man was holding something too, the mirror, the one she had seen before. Lena's hands shook as she set the photo down. She had to know. She had to understand what this meant. The mirror. The house. This woman who seemed to be a part of her. Her reflection. Staring back at her from a time that could never have been hers. She was no longer just looking at a haunted house. No, she was part of it. She had been chosen, bound to it in a way she couldn't yet comprehend. Lena's breath became shallow as she heard it, a whisper in the dark. "You shouldn't have opened it." Her eyes darted around the basement, but there was no one there. She was alone. The only sound now was the thudding of her heart, the rapid pulse in her temples. The whisper was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice weak and cracked. But there was no answer, just the silence of the house pressing down on her. The shadows in the basement seemed to grow, to stretch, until they nearly swallowed her whole. She turned and fled. But as she ascended the stairs back to the house, she knew that the house wasn't done with her yet. It had found her, and it was waiting for her to make the next move. And whatever came next, she wouldn't be able to run from. The house had claimed her. Wanted Satyam to be continued. This expanded version of Chapter 8 delves deeper into the mystery surrounding Lena's discovery. The photographs and the eerie presence of the woman who resembles Lena herself suggest a horrifying connection between Lena and the house. The introduction of the sinister mirror adds another layer of psychological and supernatural horror, implying that Lena's fate is more intertwined with the house than she realizes. The chapter ends with Lena's growing realization that she is trapped within this dark history, setting the stage for even greater horrors to come. Chapter 9. The Mirror's Truth. Lena awoke with a start, her body stiff, cold sweat clinging to her skin like a second layer. The dream, or was it a vision, had been so vivid, so real. She had been standing in front of the mirror again, staring at her reflection. But it wasn't her face that she saw. It was the woman, the one from the photographs, the one who was always just a little too familiar. Her dark eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to pierce through Lena, pulling her deeper into the reflection. And that smile, twisted, unnerving, had been there again, the same smile from the last photograph. Lena could still feel it now, that cold presence, as if the woman was somehow lurking just behind her. She shuddered, pushing herself upright in the bed. The room around her was dark and silent, save for the occasional creak of the old house settling into the night. The mirror. It was no longer just a reflection. Lena could feel its power, a silent force beckoning her. The urge to see it again, to confront what lay within it, clawed at her. But she couldn't. She refused to. Not after last night. Not after what she had seen. Her heart raced as her thoughts spiraled back to the basement. The trunk. The photographs. The box. The woman who looked like her. Her mind kept returning to the mirror, the one the woman had held, the one that had drawn them both into its depths. Lena stood and paced across the room, the silence of the house pressing in on her. The walls felt like they were closing in. The house was suffocating her. She needed to get out, to escape, to leave behind the mirror, the photographs, the dark secrets that were pulling her under. But she knew, deep down, that it wasn't possible. She couldn't escape the house. The house had already claimed her. By the time Lena reached the kitchen, her nerves were frayed. The early morning light filtered through the dust-streaked windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the room, pulling her gaze toward the hallway beyond. The hallway that led to the basement, to the mirror. She shook her head, trying to clear the dark thoughts clouding her mind. She needed to focus. There was still so much she didn't understand, so many pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. But one thing was clear. Whatever this place was, it was more than just a house. It was a prison, a trap, and she was its captive. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. At first she thought she imagined it. She had been so absorbed in her thoughts, so lost in the heavy weight of her fear. But then the knock came again, more insistent this time. Lena froze. Who could it be? Slowly she moved toward the door, the old wood groaning underfoot. Her hand hovered over the handle, her pulse thudding in her ears. She wasn't expecting anyone, not after the strange events of the previous days. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. With a sharp exhale, Lena opened the door. Standing there, bathed in the pale morning light, was a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with dark matted hair and a shadow of a beard. His face was drawn, tired, and his eyes were too knowing, too watchful, as though he had seen things he wished he hadn't. His clothes were old, weathered, like he had been traveling for a long time. He spoke before she could ask who he was. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But I need to talk to you. I think you're the one I've been looking for." Lena blinked, confused. She was about to ask him what he meant, but then her gaze caught something in his hand. A photograph. The very same photograph she had found in the trunk. The woman. Her heart skipped a beat. She stepped back instinctively, eyes darting around the hallway. "You've seen her too, haven't you?" The man continued, stepping forward. His eyes softened as he saw her reaction. "You've seen the woman? In the mirror? The one who looks like you?" Lena swallowed, her throat dry. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My name is Elias," the man said, his eyes scanning the house as if searching for something hidden in its shadows. "And I'm here because I'm the one who left those things for you. The photos. The trunk. The box." Lena's mind spun. You were the one?" "Yes." Elias nodded. "I know this is difficult to understand, but you need to listen to me. There's something you don't know about this house. Something terrible. Something that was buried long ago, and it's only now coming to the surface." Lena's heart raced. "What do you mean? What's happening?" He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "You're the key, Lena. The house has been waiting for you. It's been waiting for you to find the mirror." Lena felt a chill crawl up her spine at the mention of the mirror. She recoiled instinctively, as though it had physically struck her. "The mirror! It's evil," she whispered, feeling the words reverberate in her mind. "It's calling me." Elias shook his head. "No, it's not evil. It's not what you think. The mirror is just the doorway. The house. This place. It's not a house at all. It's a vessel. A prison." Lena felt her pulse quicken as the room seemed to close in around her. "A prison? For what?" "For her," Elias said, pointing at the photograph still clutched in his hand. "For the woman you've been seeing in your dreams, in the mirror. She is the one who was trapped here long ago, but she's not the only one." Lena's mind was racing. "But she's me. She looks like me. Why? Why is she trapped here?" Elias's expression darkened. "Because she was you, or at least she was meant to be. That's the secret. You're not the first. There have been others before you. Others who have come to this house, who have been drawn into its power. They saw her, saw the reflection, and believed they could escape it, but they didn't." Lena's throat tightened. "So what happens to me?" "You will be the one to set her free," Elias whispered. "The one who can break the cycle." Lena's stomach churned. "How do you know all of this? Who are you, really?" Elias took a deep breath, his eyes flickering with something that could only be described as regret. "I've been here before. Long ago. I thought I could escape. I thought I could stop it, but I was wrong. Now it's your turn. You have no choice but to face the truth." Lena's knees buckled beneath her as the weight of his words pressed down. There was no way out. There never had been. The house was alive. It had always been alive. And now it was waiting for her to set it free. To be continued. So this expansion of Chapter 9 introduces Elias, the mysterious man who holds crucial knowledge about the house and the dark forces within it. He reveals that Lena is connected to the house's dark history, and that she plays a pivotal role in breaking the cycle of terror. This chapter further deepens the supernatural horror and psychological tension, setting the stage for a terrifying confrontation with the house's true nature. Chapter 10. The Final Reflection. But the house seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the floorboards creaking as if they too were alive, breathing in the same air that filled Lena's lungs. She stood frozen in the hallway, staring at Elias, her heart racing in her chest. The walls closed in, the shadows lengthening with every passing second. She could feel it, the weight of the house, pressing down on her, forcing her toward the inevitable. "You have to go." Elias's voice was soft but insistent. "It's the only way." Lena shook her head, her mind struggling to piece together the fragments of what Elias had told her. She had learned so much in the past few days, but she still didn't understand everything. What did it all mean? Why had the house chosen her? And why did the woman, the one who looked like her, have to be set free? "You're not making sense," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't understand any of this." Elias's eyes were filled with a deep sadness, as though he had seen the same tragedy unfold countless times before. "I know. It's not easy to grasp, but this house, it's a place of lost time, a prison for those who can't escape, those who think they can fight it." He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "And you are the one. You've always been the one." Lena swallowed, her throat dry. The words felt like a curse, their weight pressing on her chest. "What do you mean? What's going to happen to me?" "You'll understand when you see it," Elias replied softly. "When you see the truth." Before Lena could ask him to explain further, a low rumble filled the air. The house trembled beneath her feet, and the floorboards shuddered as though something vast and ancient had just shifted within its depths. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Lena's pulse quickened. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The house," Elias said. "It's waking up. The time has come. The mirror is the key." Without another word, Elias turned and began to walk down the hallway, his movements slow and deliberate. Lena hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She didn't want to follow him. She didn't want to go back to the mirror, but she knew she had no choice. There was no escape, not anymore. She followed him down the darkened hall, the silence between them growing heavier with each step. They reached the door to the basement, its wooden frame warped and twisted as though the very structure of the house was resisting their presence. Elias pushed it open with a groan of protest, revealing the dark staircase that led down into the bowels of the house. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She could hear something, soft and faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, a low murmuring sound that seemed to call her name. It was the same voice she had heard in her dreams, the one that echoed from the mirror. The woman, the mirror. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she descended the stairs, her legs feeling like lead. Every step felt like an eternity, the darkness closing in around her as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. She reached the bottom of the stairs, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light of the basement. The mirror was there. It stood in the center of the room, its surface rippling like water, as though it were alive. Lena could see her reflection, distorted, twisted, shimmering before her eyes. But there was something else, something far worse. The woman who had been haunting her every thought, every moment. Lena stepped closer, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't look away. She had to know. The mirror held the answers. It held the key. "You're ready now," Elias said softly from behind her, his voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. "This is your moment. Don't be afraid." Lena wanted to turn to him, to ask him what he meant, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the mirror. The woman's face, her face, stared back at her with an eerie, knowing smile, as though she had been waiting for Lena to arrive all along. Lena took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she reached out toward the glass. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the world seemed to lurch. Suddenly the room around her blurred, the edges of her vision darkened, and the air grew thick, oppressive, like 1,000 hands were reaching for her. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as though the woman was speaking directly to her. "You cannot escape." The voice was a low growl, 1,000 whispers melding into one. Lena stumbled back, her heart racing as panic surged through her. But the mirror was pulling her in. She could feel it now, a magnetic force, an invisible hand, dragging her closer. She reached out with both hands, desperate to break free. But it was too late. The mirror shattered. A flash of light exploded from the surface, blinding her for a moment. She screamed, her voice swallowed by the deafening sound of glass splintering. The world spun as the reflection of the woman, the one who had been her all along, stepped through the shards of the broken mirror, her dark eyes locking onto Lena's. And in that instant, Lena realized the truth. The woman wasn't a reflection. She wasn't a stranger. She had always been a part of her. A fragment of herself that had been lost to time, locked away in the mirror, in the house, waiting to return. The woman spoke, her voice echoing in Lena's mind, soft but chilling. You are me, I am you. Together we are whole again. Lena fell to her knees, her body trembling. She understood now. She had been trapped, bound to this house, to this fate, for far longer than she could remember. The cycle would continue. It had to. She was no longer Lena. She was both of them. And as the woman's form merged with hers, as her mind unraveled into the cold void of eternity, Lena felt the house begin to shift. The walls cracked, the foundation groaned, and the silence, once oppressive, was replaced by a deafening roar. The house, too, had been waiting for this moment. Lena was lost. The woman had claimed her. Together, they would haunt the house forever, a reflection of what was, what had been, and what would never be again. End of chapter 10. End of the story. In this conclusion, Lena finally confronts the truth about the house, the mirror, and her own identity. The house was never just a prison. It was a vessel for lost souls, caught in an eternal cycle of reflection and rebirth. Lena's fate is sealed, merging with the woman who had haunted her dreams, and the two are now one, trapped in the house for eternity. The eerie psychological horror intensifies as Lena becomes both the victim and the tormentor, leaving the reader with an unsettling, unbreakable sense of dread. Epilogue. The endless echo. The house stands, as it always has, shrouded in an aura of quiet, unrelenting darkness. Time has no meaning here, for it is bound by the twisted threads of its own existence, woven through with forgotten secrets and endless torment. The crumbling walls, once full of life, now whisper only of the past, of those who came before, those who could not escape, and those who, like Lena, became a part of the house. Lena is no longer just a name. She is a whisper in the dark, an echo carried on the winds that circle through the broken windows. Her form is no longer human, nor is it entirely the woman who had waited for her. They are one now, two souls bound together by fate, forever entwined in the fractured mirror that had once kept them apart. The house watches over them, as it watches over all who enter, its cold eyes never blinking, its dark heart never resting. In the stillness, a faint sound stirs, the softest echo of a laugh, hollow and disembodied. It drifts through the hallways, barely perceptible, a sound that could easily be mistaken for a breath, a sigh, or the creaking of the floorboards. But it is not. It is Lena, or perhaps the woman, or perhaps the both of them, now locked in a place where time has no power, no direction, where life and death blend together like a forgotten dream. The mirror remains broken, its shards scattered across the floor of the basement. Yet the reflection is still there, not in the glass, but in the very air itself. The house, as it breathes, reflects them both, endlessly, eternally. In every corner, in every shadow, there are fragments of who they were, who they are, and who they will always be. The woman, Lena's other self, will never leave, and neither will Lena. Their presence is a part of the house now, woven into its fabric, an integral, cursed piece of its dark puzzle. Every night they whisper to each other, telling stories of the life they once had, of the world beyond these walls, of the lives that were never meant to cross their paths. But there is no escape. The house has no door. It has no way out. For those who are trapped here, time stretches infinitely. The house does not fade. It does not decay. It is a place of timelessness, a place where the dead never leave, where the living never forget. The house keeps them all. Those who have given up, those who have succumbed, those who have fallen into the endless cycle of its pull. And so, Lena and the woman, together at last, will wander its dark halls forever. They will never be free, never leave, never find rest. They are now a part of the house's twisted history, bound to it for as long as the house stands, whispering to anyone who dares to listen, anyone who comes next. For the house will wait, as it always has. Mais amours, the end. This epilogue serves as a chilling closure to the story, reinforcing the themes of imprisonment and the inescapability of the house's dark influence. The horror isn't over, for the house still lingers, its influence continuing to claim those who come near, and Lena, now merged with the woman, becomes one of its eternal inhabitants. Their voices, once human, will now echo through the halls forever, a warning to anyone who might dare cross the threshold.